Shalom Aleichem. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle, and we're pleased tonight to present From Krakow to Krypton, Jews, Justice, and Comic Books, exploring the Jewish immigrants who created the superheroes that continue to feature in comic books and on screens the world over today. And we'll explore how our progressive Jewish values have inspired comic book creators from the 1930s through today. The Workers' Circle is a Jewish social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through Jewish cultural engagement, Yiddish language learning, education, and collective social and economic justice activism. To put it in terms of tonight's program, for over 120 years, our community has been on the front lines fighting for truth, justice, and freedom for everyone. We are proud to be inspired by our Yiddishkeit heritage and its culture and activist traditions. In addition to being the home to the largest Yiddish language program in the world and providing programs that educate us on critical social justice issues, we collectively engage teens, college students, and people of all ages in impactful collective activism, Jewish cultural experiences, and we create meaningful connections to our rich Yiddish traditions and heritage. Tonight's program features a presentation by award-winning author, graphic novelist, screenwriter, and lecturer Arie Kaplan. We will be providing time for a Q&A at the end of this program, and we're asking you to please put your questions in the Q&A feature in Zoom throughout the program. You're welcome to submit your questions anytime. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Arie Kaplan. As a nonfiction author, Arie is perhaps best known for his book, From Krakow to Krypton, Jews and Comic Books, which was named a Booklist Editor's Choice Books for Youth winner in 2009. Arie is also a children's author, and he has written dozens of books and graphic novels for young readers, including Frankie and the Dragon, Lego Star Wars, the official Stormtrooper training manual, the Jurassic Park Little Golden Book, and Red Titan and the Runaway Robot. As a comic book writer, Arie has written dozens of comic scripts featuring everyone from Superman to Speed Racers for numerous comic book publishers, including DC Comics, IDW Publishing, Archie Comics, and Dark Horse. And he has written over 24 humor pieces for Mad Magazine. In addition to his work on the printed page, Arie is a screenwriter for television, video games, and transmedia. His television writing credits include Charlie's Colorform City, Cyberchase, and codename Kids Next Door. His game writing credits include EQ, The Next Generation Lodestar, Paranormal State, Poison Spring, and Law and Order Legacies. And now, please join me in welcoming Arie Kaplan to take us from Krakow to Krypton. Welcome, Arie.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Really appreciate it. Okay, all right, everybody. So yes, I am going to lead you on a journey of sorts, all right? But before we go on that journey, we're going to go on this one. Before I tell you the story of why there were so many Jews in the comic book industry at its infancy, which iconic characters they created, and whether any of those characters were subtextually Jewish, before I tell you that story, I got to tell you this one because it sort of sets up the whole thing. All right, sets up the whole thing as far as why I was obsessed with this stuff growing up and why I was obsessed with telling this story. When I was in kindergarten, I had a teacher named Mr. Manischewitz. Yes, that was his name. And he had a really interesting way of teaching us the Aleph Bet, the Hebrew alphabet, for those of you who don't know. You see, what he did was he decided that he was going to teach us how to draw the letter Aleph by using Popeye, Popeye, Popeye. Yeah. So he decided, first of all, he was going to draw Popeye's beanpole body, and that's the main core of the letter Aleph, and then he was going to, have one arm, one bulging bicep going up like this, and one bulging bicep going down like that, and that's the way he was going to teach us how to draw that letter of the alphabet. It's a very easy thing to do because kids understand cartoons and they gravitate towards them. Well, you see, he was trying to use comics to make us passionate about Hebrew, but in my case, he was doing the exact opposite. He was using Hebrew to get me really passionate about comics. I've been obsessed with Popeye and comic books ever since. So you see, years ago, when I was starting out in the comic book industry as a writer, I decided I would try to figure out why it is that so many characters were created by Jewish people, why there were so many Jews in the comics industry. You see, I didn't understand. I thought, okay, that you can't say that it's because Jews are better than other types of people telling comic book stories or drawing or writing comics. You get into some really dodgy areas there. So what's the real reason? What's the socio-political reason? And the thing is, I was writing for Mad Magazine at the time, and that got me in with Al Jaffe, who of course is the creator of Mad's Fold-ins and Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions. You see, when I talked to Al, that sort of opened up the floodgates, because Al has been, and he's 101 years old, still alive. I just talked to him on his 101st birthday earlier this year. I could tell you all about that a little later. He knows everybody. What I found out is that the comics industry in the 30s and 40s, when Al was starting out, was so tight-knit and so insular, and so like everybody knew everybody. And so what's fascinating about that is Al was able to get me connected with almost everybody he knew who was still alive from the golden age of comics at that point. So he connected me to Will Eisner, who connected me to Stan Lee, who connected me to Joe Kubert. And if these names don't mean anything to you, well, they will pretty soon. You see, I'm going to give you all the key to the comics industry. We have the time for such a presentation today. I'm going to give you a lot of nuggets of history here. And you might think, well, he's acting sort of like a joker, but we're going to have a lot of fun. And I think comics have been a staple of American society for about 80 years, and we're going to figure out why. So here we go, from Krakow to Krypton. One of the things that Al told me is that was so fascinating to me is that when the comic book industry was first starting out, it wasn't all original material. A lot of it was reprints of newspaper strips. It was Little Orphan Annie. It was Popeye. It was Thimble Theater, Popeye. But the royalties cost a lot of money. And so these comic book publishers started thinking, well, how can we do this in a way where it can cost a lot less, the talent could cost less, so they got people they could afford. And a lot of the time, the people that they could afford were people who were working class, people who couldn't ask for higher wages, people who didn't have formal training, people who were immigrants or the children of immigrants. And that's how you have all these Jewish people drifting into the comic book industry, because they fit all those criteria. Now, one of the people who is generally regarded as one of the fathers of the comic book industry in the 30s is Max Gaines. Maxwell Gaines, or if you know him really well, Charlie Gaines or MC Gaines. We're going to talk a bit about his family throughout this lecture today. So the Gaines family is sort of a through line here. All right. Now, Max Gaines wasn't an artist. He wasn't a writer. He was sometimes an editor. He was often a publisher. But one of the things that he did that counted the most was something that you might think of as the most minor contribution to the comic book industry, but it was a very major contribution, really. And what it was that he was an unemployed novelty salesman, and he was trying in 1933, and he was trying to think of what he would do next with his life. He had a wife, he had kids, he had no way to support them. He had tried all these different get-rich-quick schemes. They didn't work. He's sitting in his parents' attic, and he's looking at this yellowing stack of newspapers, and he's thinking, it's, I have nothing else to do. Reread some old newspaper strips. And he does that, and he's thinking, I'm rereading these old newspaper strips. It's fun. Maybe other people would like to do it too. And so he came up with the idea of reprinting these old newspaper strips and calling it a comic book. The term comic book had floated around in the popular consciousness for a couple decades prior to that. But he was one of the people, he was the one person who just sort of solidified everything, who said, okay, it's going to be this size, and it's going to be this number of pages, and he created the format, and he sort of consolidated all of that and turned it into an actual business. Okay. So again, he didn't really create anything new or unique, but it was one of the first examples in American popular culture of sort of repackaging or repositioning something to make something else. And so again, as I said, those first couple of years of the comic book industry was really just reprints. It was reprints of old newspaper strips. People liked it. Publishers thought, oh God, this is getting really expensive. So again, what they had to do was they had to go out to kids who wouldn't ask for very much money. And this is how the first generation of comic book creators started. Also, another thing that you have to keep in mind is that for these first comic book creators, a lot of them would have faced anti-Semitism if they had gone elsewhere. One of the things that Al Jaffe told me, and this was backed up by other folks, by Will Eisner, the creator of The Spirit, who was also a legendary graphic novelist for about the last 3 decades of his life. He told me this as well. Some of the others told me this too, which is that there was so much anti-Semitism in America in the 1930s that a lot of these people who drifted into the comic book industry would have been happy going almost any other place. They would have been happy working at a bank, for example. Al had a friend named Stan Mazie, who was blonde-haired, blue eyes. He was Jewish, but he didn't look stereotypically Jewish. And so he got a job as a bank teller. Al and his friends were really jealous. They would have loved to get jobs at the bank, paid really well, but they couldn't because they were Jewish. And because in those days, you could actually ask someone what their religion or ethnicity was in a job interview. Today, that's illegal, thank goodness. But back then, you could actually do that. And so for that reason, Al was kept out of a lot of higher paying fields. He tried to get jobs doing storyboards or concept drawings for an ad agency. And he was really good. He showed me a lot of the artwork that he did when he was a teenager. But they would say to him, oh, sorry, we already have 2 Jews in the office. We've met our quota, and that's the reason that he didn't get work at a higher paying field like advertising. So it was comic books for him, and it was comic books for a lot of other people. Now, there were comic book characters before Superman. We're going to look at a clip in just a moment that's going to say that Superman was the first comic book superhero. It's debatable. It's a good clip. I wouldn't show it to all you fine folk if it was a bad clip, but was he the first superhero? I don't know. I mean, the first superhero in general? No. Zorro predates Superman. Zorro is a superhero. He was a pulp magazine character. The Lone Ranger was a radio character on radio. He predates Superman. Same with the Green Hornet, who also predates Superman. That there were a lot of other characters like that. Characters that you could definitely say these are either superheroes or superhero adjacent. The Scarlet Pimpernel comes to mind, definitely. The Shadow from Pulp Magazine's Doc Savage. Okay, all of those characters predate Superman. What Superman really did was it really set the standard as far as what a superhero should look like and what a superhero should be like. And the funny thing to me is that even though there had been comic book superheroes before Superman was so incredibly popular that after his creation, all the other publishers were trying to come up with something to compete with Superman. And so you saw them kind of more or less copying what Siegel and Schuster, Superman's creators, were doing with Superman. And I'll I'll get into more of the details of this after we show the clip. But let's look at a clip. We'll look at what Siegel and Schuster were like a little bit. Jerry Siegel, who was the writer and co-creator of Superman, and his creative partner, Joe Shuster, who also co-created Superman and drew a lot of the early Superman comics. We're going to look at this clip. We're going to see some of their work and what it's all about.
In 1938, the first and greatest superhero of them all, Superman, leaped from the pages of Action Comics #1 into the imaginations of children everywhere.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Today, Superman has become a national icon, and that 10-cent comic could sell for over $300,000. But the Man of Steel nearly didn't get published. At first, only 2 people believed in him, his creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster.
In 1931, there were 2 17-year-old kids from Cleveland, Ohio, who were obsessed with science fiction.
Jerry Siegel wrote the stories, and his pal Joe Shuster illustrated them. The creations were never sold. Yet these poor Jewish kids dreamed that their sci-fi fantasies would someday bring them fame and fortune. In the 1930s, the big new trend in newspapers was the adventure comic strip.
There was quality in the writing, there was quality in the drawing, there was just a general air of capital Q quality associated with newspaper comics. That's what Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster wanted for themselves.
Siegel and Shuster's hero combined elements of everything they'd read, from comic strips to pulp magazines. He would be the last survivor of a dead planet, rocketed to Earth like a science fiction Moses, with the strength of Hercules, fighting for the common man, Superman. Many years later, Jerry Siegel wrote about his inspiration. He recalled, "I had crushes on girls who didn't care I existed, so it occurred to me, what if I was really terrific, jumping over buildings or throwing cars around?" Superman was sent to every newspaper syndicate in the country. They all said no.
I wrote back to them and told them this very patronizing letter that they weren't ready for prime time, that they should stay in Cleveland for another year until they developed their art style, because the art was quite crude. So much for my great editorial judgment.
Newspapers were saying no, but another, newer medium held out some promise: comic books. Selling on newsstands for a dime, comic books were originally just reprints of newspaper strips.
It was the cheapest way for newspaper publishers to repackage their comic strips. It was the video tape of its day.
Then in 1935, Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, a pulp magazine writer turned comic publisher, had a revolutionary idea: comic books with all new, never-before-published material. But to make his idea work, the material had to come cheap.
The only people they could get to produce this content were guys that couldn't get work doing anything else because they were too young, or they were too inexperienced, or they were Jewish.
Siegel and Shuster fit the bill. Wheeler Nicholson's company, soon to be called DC, gave the pair steady work. In 1938, the company, under new ownership, took a chance with the strip everyone had rejected. Siegel and Shuster, both 23, finally saw Superman published in the first issue of DC's Action Comics.
Shuster cut up the panels, rearranged them in comic page form, and the golden age of comics began with the first issue of Action Comics.
Imagine how amazing it would be to open up that first issue. I'll never have anything approaching the level of a sense of wonder that those first kids that opened up Action #1 had way back in the day.
The first stories were crude but direct. Unlike most newspaper heroes, Superman lived in the same world as his readers. This wasn't medieval England or another planet. This was a city, a metropolis of lynch mobs and wife-beaters, where politicians were crooks, where businessmen exploited workers and started wars in South America. It was the real world of 1938, a world in need of a hero.
He was the spirit of the people. He was up against corrupt landlords and vile dictators and bad generals and all that.
The New Deal, of course, was an effort to try to redirect people to look to a powerful force, the federal government, to serve as their benefactor, their protector against, local and greedy, corrupt interests. Comic book superheroes were super New Dealers, like costume versions of Franklin Roosevelt.
But what really made Superman revolutionary was his alter ego, Clark Kent.
Kent made Superman accessible. And in turn, he needed to be Kent to be human, to have access to us.
Superman comes from this other place to America. He can never go back there. It's been destroyed, very much as the Europe that especially the European Jews left behind was eventually destroyed. He is adopted by this ultimate American couple. He leaves behind the vaguely Hebraic-sounding Kal-El and becomes Clark Kent, the ultimate American. Even if you don't look at him as an allegory of the immigrant, he is an immigrant. He did come to America, and he did make good.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, really. One of the questions that I'm always asking myself whenever I look at these old Superman comics from the late 30s, especially, from the late 30s and early 40s, is when it was really just Siegel and Schuster doing all the work, before Joe Shuster had any assistants helping him out, and what they called ghost artists, really, in those days, because they weren't getting any credit. It looked incredibly crude. The comics that you just saw in this clip looked very, very crude. And I sort of got to think to myself, just when I was writing this book, this was a question I kept asking: why was it so successful? Why did this comic hit a nerve, whereas a lot of others didn't? Why did this character hit a nerve, whereas a lot of others didn't? Siegel and Schuster, this was not the first character that they created. They had a character called Dr. Occult, who was a ghost detective, who was sort of a forerunner of characters like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Hellboy and Blade the Vampire Hunter. But he was many decades before any of those characters. Why wasn't he the big breakout hit character of Siegel and Schuster? Why was it Superman? And, you look at the comics and they're so crudely written and they're so crudely drawn. And you see what Schuster's trying to do. He's trying to sort of ape the style of Hal Foster, who did Prince Valiant. He's trying to ape the style of Alex Raymond, who was the cartoonist behind Flash Gordon. It looks like kind of like B-list Flash Gordon art, but it has this charm to it that you can't deny. Siegel and Schuster were so dialed into these stories, their hearts were really in it, and I think that really shows through. And I think that's more important in a lot of ways than how polished they were as craftsmen and how polished they were as writers and artists. I think that's largely what it was. I think it's also, they sort of like repackaged a lot of ideas and concepts that you had seen in science fiction before then, but in a new and different way. And it was new and different enough that it made people sort of take a step back and say, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Like, okay, the idea of a superhero character who had a secret identity was not new. Lone Ranger had a secret identity. Green Hornet had a secret identity. Zorro had a secret identity. All these, the Shadow had a secret identity. He had a few different secret identities. Long story. Anyway, so what was it about Superman? The thing is that Zorro's secret identity is who he really is. All right, that's his real face. Zorro is the false face that he puts on. All right. The Green Hornet is not really the real person. The real person is who he is when you take off his mask. Here's where Superman is kind of a twist on that old concept. Superman is the real face. Clark Kent, the secret identity, is the false face. You get it? So like Green Hornet, when he puts on that mask, he's no longer Britt Reed anymore. Britt Reed is the real person. Green Hornet's the facade. Here, the superhero is not the facade. The superhero is the real person. The secret identity, quote unquote, is Clark Kent doing an impression of what he thinks Earthlings are like. And that's where that whole concept is really genius. That's where that whole concept makes you take a step back and say, oh, okay, that's a new twist on the superhero idea I haven't quite heard before. That his mask, so to speak, is this pair of glasses. And, then it poses an additional challenge for the writers and the artists, because you can tell it's me. When I put on these glasses, you're not like, oh, wait, where did Arie go? Or when I take them off, you're not like, wait, who's this other person? So it can't just be the glasses. You then, as the writer and artist of Superman comics, have to convince people, that the people who are reading the comic, that it makes sense, that it's plausible, that even though Clark Kent has just gotten rid of his glasses, that people see him as a whole different person. So what that means is that you have to kind of think, what would Clark Kent have to do to make people think that? He would have to walk with stooped shoulders. He would not look people in the eye. He would be incredibly shy. So people would never think that he was Superman. So that's kind of the challenge that then poses. And I think that's one of the reasons that people bought into Superman. Also, honestly, a lot of people can relate to Superman because they think, okay, people don't value me. People don't see what I have to offer them. People think that I'm Clark Kent, but I'm really the Superman. So that's a way in which I think that character is relatable to people all the time. I think that a lot of people feel like they are Superman, and they are seen by society as Clark Kent. So I think it becomes this potent metaphor for a lot of things. Like Michael Chabon said in the clip that we just saw, it also could be seen as a metaphor for the immigrant experience, because he is an immigrant. He did come from this other planet. Now, is that something that Siegel and Schuster had in mind? Did they create Superman thinking, we're going to make this a metaphor for the immigrant experience? I don't think so. I think that when they were creating Superman, they were trying to come up with some sort of character that felt very epic and very iconic, and they were borrowing from a lot of myths and legends and stories. I think that it does seem like the Moses story in sci-fi drag, but I think that the reason for that, is not it's not that Siegel and Schuster were writing like code for their Jewish readers. It's not like they were saying, see, we're creating a Jewish character. They weren't doing that. But they were borrowing from Moses. They were borrowing from the King Arthur legend. They were borrowing from the Hercules story. What do all these stories have in common? They're all about people who were raised by foster families, and they had no idea who they really were and what their true birthright was, what their true heritage was, until they assume the mantle of leadership when they become an adult. And so Moses, he's nudged down the river by his real family in a basket. He's intercepted by the Pharaoh's family, who raises him as one of their own. Okay, so Superman's story, his real parents put him in the rocket. He floats through outer space, lands on Earth. A kindly Kansas farm couple find him, intercept him, and raise him as one of their own. Yes, it seems very much like the Moses story, but not that different than the King Arthur story too. And the reason is, a lot of these myths and legends and stories of various religions involve a foster family taking care of this hero character, this savior character. That is something that we find in cultures all throughout the world. And so again, I think that Siegel and Schuster wanted their character to read as epic and heroic and mythic, not so much as Jewish, but as those other things. And obviously some Jewish stories get thrown into the mix there, because some of these stories are stories about Jewish people. Moses comes from the Old Testament, comes from the Torah, comes from the Hebrew Bible. Comes from the Jewish Bible, rather. So yes, Jewish stories are going to get thrown in the mix there. Now, look, like Michael Chabon also said, Superman's real name is Kal-El. It's vaguely Hebraic sounding, as he says. It's very hard not to notice the fact that Kol El in Hebrew roughly translates to all that God is, and that's a very on-the-nose name to give a character who's very godlike, who's very angelic, which Superman definitely is. So, did Siegel and Schuster have that in mind? Well, yes and no. I mean, they both had gone to Hebrew school, or cheder, as they probably called it. They did live in the overwhelmingly Jewish suburb of Glendale, in Cleveland, and a lot of their classmates in high school were Jewish. A lot of the people that they knew in their everyday lives were Jewish. They probably knew what Kol El meant. All right. Not that that's a phrase that people commonly just spit out, but I'm saying that Kal-El, Superman's Kryptonian name, roughly translates to Kol El. They probably named him that on purpose. But again, not that they were writing code, just that this is something that people did in the days before you could just Google this, in the days before you could just look something up like that, like you can today. People would sometimes use, like, for example, Jewish science fiction writers would use Hebrew gestures or Hebrew words and claim that they were alien gestures or alien words. You see that the writers and actors on Star Trek doing it in the 60s with this hand signal, which is the Vulcans live long and prosper signal. But it's also the symbol of the Kohanim class in Judaism. And Leonard Nimoy, who played Mr. Spock, was Jewish. Some of the writers on the show were Jewish, And so, they're going to, in the 60s, they're going to use this and say, oh, it's a Vulcan hand signal, because most of the audience is not going to know that it's actually a Jewish hand signal, right? Now, Superman was not the only superhero to reach prominence in the golden age of comics. This is an era that also brought us Batman and Wonder Woman and all these other characters, Green Lantern, The Flash, Plastic Man. However, so many of these characters started imitating Superman from the moment they were created, because it's really obvious that a lot of these other publishers were like, get me the next Superman, get me one of those, because that's the thing that happens whenever something is popular in pop culture, is everyone else wants to try and duplicate it. So you suddenly saw, because Superman wears his underwear on the outside, you suddenly saw other superhero characters wearing their underwear on the outside. Superman has a secret identity because he wants some privacy. He wants to just be alone with his thoughts sometimes. Well, you saw a lot of other superhero characters having secret identities for actually no good reason. Just because, why? Because it's a trope, because Superman does it. So these things became tropes, they became conventions, they became cliches, largely because of Superman. But what's funny is that a lot of the writers and artists behind these other characters hadn't had their characters as well thought out as Superman, so didn't have as good a reason for putting these elements into their characters as Superman had. Now, as I said, Superman was not the only character created by Jewish people in those days. We also have a character called Captain America, and we have a limited amount of time today. We don't have time to go through the entire Golden Age, so unfortunately, we won't be able to do that. But I think we can at least look at this one other character from the Golden Age of comics, which is Captain America. We're going to look at a clip right now of some early pages of Captain America and some information about his creators.
In 1939, the war in Europe had begun. Even though America wasn't involved yet, many superheroes were. By the end of the year, the Submariner began turning his general hatred of humanity against the Nazis in particular.
We just could all see what a menace Hitler was. It was more than what he was doing to the Jews. It was what he was doing to the whole world. He was gobbling up countries.
Superman's creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster thought the Man of Steel could stop the war in 2 pages. In a special story for Look magazine in February 1940, Superman simply grabs Hitler and his then ally Stalin and drops them off at the League of Nations. End of story, end of war.
In American society, we believe in instant solutions. Superheroes do that.
Superman's paper victory made its way to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who reportedly called Superman a Jew. The official SS newspaper mocked Siegel as physically and intellectually circumcised. Well before the U.S. entered the war, superheroes weren't just waving the flag, they were wearing it. Timely Comics had the greatest anti-Nazi of them all, who burst on the scene with an unforgettable cover.
Captain America threw a smashing right cross to the jaw of Adolf Hitler. That said everything about the character.
They got hate mail for that. They got hate mail from isolationists.
But most superhero fans didn't care.
Captain America exploded on the newsstand and sold out of his first issue.
The story begins as war is looming. FDR approves a secret project to create an army of super soldiers. Frail Steve Rogers is the first volunteer. The brilliant Professor Reinstein injects him with a strange liquid. In seconds, Rogers is a perfect physical specimen, dubbed Captain America. When a Nazi spy kills the professor, the secret of the formula dies with him. So Captain America carries on alone, except for Army mascot turned kid sidekick, Bucky Barnes. Captain America was created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who guided him through his first 10 issues.
Joe was a writer. Jack was always at that board, mumbling to himself, smoking a cigar, and drawing.
Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg, will become one of the legends of the industry.
He was the Shakespeare or Cervantes, or take your pick, of comic books. He introduced a whole new level of motion into comic books, and that was revolutionary for the time. The page couldn't contain the degree of action.
Okay, so yeah, the interesting thing about Captain America is how he is used, given that he's wearing the American flag. It's how different writers and artists use him. And I think it's a good idea also to talk a little bit about right now what the politics and what the ideals were of the people who created these characters. You know, when Superman was first created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, he wasn't fighting mad scientists, he wasn't fighting killer robots, he wasn't fighting imps from other dimensions like Mr. Mxyzptlk. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I love those stories, but for the first year or so of Superman stories that Siegel and Shuster churned out, he was fighting abusive, this was in the first clip a little bit. He was fighting abusive husbands. He was fighting, and taking them to jail so that they wouldn't abuse their wives anymore. He was fighting fascists. He was fighting slumlords. He was fighting people like that. Think about what a revolutionary thing that is to put in a comic book that's ostensibly aimed at children, especially in a generation where, quite frankly, spousal abuse was normalized. It wasn't as frowned upon as it is in today's society. You're talking about, it's not that misogyny doesn't exist today, but there was so much more misogyny in the 1930s when Superman was first created. So you're seeing that Siegel and Shuster were very progressive and were trying to put these progressive messages into the Superman comics. Similarly, with the early Captain America comics, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were doing something that was quite revolutionary, because they were taking a comic book superhero and using him as a political cartoon, which is essentially what you're doing when you're putting a guy dressed in the American flag who calls himself Captain America, putting him punching Hitler on the cover of his first comic at a time when America has yet to enter World War II, or World War II is happening, but America is staying out of it. And it's before America had entered the war. Think about the message that sends. What I think is fascinating is that also when Captain America gets thawed and it gets frozen in ice in the 1960s, in that Avengers story by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, and then he's thawed out by the other Avengers, and he's been frozen in ice for 20 years, and he's trying to reacclimate himself to the world and see how the world's changed in the 20 years that he's been frozen. He comes out not as a conservative, but he comes out as a liberal, which I think is fascinating, because the easy thing for Lee and Kirby to do would have been to have made that character this staunch, true blue, patriotic, conservative right-winger. But no, they actually make him a liberal progressive. They make him very left-wing. And that's something that's continued with Captain America's depiction in the comics to this day. And that's, that there's the Captain America stories, a lot of them are about racism or xenophobia. They're about issues like that. And I think that that's fascinating, that the writers who've written Captain America stories over the decades haven't used that character as an easy way to, as like, let's have him be some sort of right-wing character where he's very upset by where this country's gone. He's upset at the way this country's gone, but not in the way that you think, not like the way that your right-wing grandfather would be. He's upset at the way this country's gone because there's still racism, and there's still misogyny, there's still xenophobia, and there's still all these horrible things that he would have thought would have been taken away while he was under the ice, And so I think that that's kind of fascinating. And that applies to so many of the people who were working in comics in those days. You're talking about a generation of comics creators. Not all, this wasn't true of all of them, but for a lot of them, they were very left-wing, they were very progressive, and they did put messages like that in their comics. For Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad Magazine, before he created Mad Magazine, he edited and wrote these two war comics for EC Comics in the early 50s that were published by Bill Gaines, the son of Max Gaines, who we talked about at the beginning. Remember, I said this family would be really important, and so it is. But the interesting thing about the two war comics, Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat, is that Harvey Kurtzman made sure not to depict the enemy soldiers. When he depicted American soldiers fighting enemy soldiers, soldiers from other countries, he made a very, very conscious attempt not to depict the enemy soldiers, the foreign soldiers, in a racist way or in a way that was in any way othering or xenophobic. And that was a very new thing for comics. It was a very new approach. And he made sure to do that. And so it's not really surprising that years later, Harvey Kurtzman served as a sort of spiritual godfather and mentor to many of the underground cartoonists in the 60s and 70s, like Art Spiegelman, who created Mouse. Now, I think I kind of have to kind of wrap it up a little bit right now. So I don't have time to show the next clip, unfortunately. There's like versions of this lecture that are different lengths. However, I do want to thank everyone for having me here. And this isn't the end, because I want to open it up for, Q&A if we can, right?
Yes. Let's see if I'm being pinned to. Oh, no, now I think I've screwed that up. Sorry. I'll remove my pen. Okay. Hi. Thank you. And one quick question. A couple people have asked for the title of the documentary that you've shown clips from.
Yeah, that was Comic Book Superheroes Unmasked, and it's narrated by the wonderful Keith David, brilliant character actor Keith David, and hosted by Peter Wilson, who was at that time. This was almost 20 years ago. This is, I think, in 2003. She was starring in the beloved and very memorable movie League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a terrible movie based on a brilliant comic book series. There's a lot of that going on. Although these days the caliber of comic book movies tends to be quite higher. They tend to be quite higher quality than they were back then as a whole. So that's Comic Book Superheroes Unmasked. It's a really good documentary.
Yeah, a number of people are hoping that they can watch it on demand or via a streaming channel. So hopefully it's accessible. And if it is, I think we'll let people know. Everyone who's watching now, there will be a follow-up email. Whoever registered will receive, and you'll get more information about Arie and his work, and also references to some of the things he's spoken about in today's program. Yeah.
I would like to say one thing, if it's okay, Ann.
Say anything.
As I was putting together my notes today for this lecture, I got the news that Gilbert Gottfried had died.
Yeah.
And he was someone I worked with on a couple of occasions. I was a staff writer on this show, on this TV show called World's Dumbest, which was on True TV 10 years ago, actually. And he was one of the cast members, and it was so much fun working with him. And he was so gracious, and what an easy person to work with. And he was so cool. And sometimes I would just talk to him, and I talked to him because he was a big Mad Magazine fan too. And he actually, I think he may have written one or two pieces for Mad. I know he wrote some forewords and introductions to some of the Mad collections, like reprint collections. And so he was definitely considered sort of a friend of Mad, a friend of the magazine. And he knew a lot of the editors, he was friends with them as well. And he also played Mr. Mxyzptlk, the Superman villain in the Adventures of Superman animated series in the 1990s. And he wrote an issue of the Superboy comic in those days too, because he was a villain, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s on the Superboy TV show. So I just want to say I wanted to dedicate this lecture to him and to his memory.
That's very nice. That's very meaningful too. It's a sad loss for everyone. And he's connected to so many things. It's an incredible reach, from comic books to acting to comedian. So thank you. Thanks for that. And if anyone on social media, there are stories about him just, off the charts. People are just talking about connections. He was out there with a lot of people, and people are sharing their connections and their stories. There's a few questions here about Superman, not surprising. People are referencing the fact that one of his creators was Canadian, so we should give credit to Superman being half Canadian, which of course, is all great. That's thanks to Leslie Smith and two people, Edith and also Leslie, talks about the fact that with Superman's creation, there's a Moses vibe to his backstory, but they both talk about what about a sort of messianic message. And Leslie specifically asks, is he as much a golem as Moses, which is interesting.
I talk about that, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but I wrote this book called From Krakow to Krypton, which the lecture is loosely based on. Written by me, Arie Kaplan. Anyway, and no big deal. But I was waiting for someone to mention the Jesus / messianic vibe, first of all, because yes, that does come across. But again, certain aspects of the Jesus origin story, I hope I'm not offending anyone by calling Jesus' story an origin story. But it is an origin story. It's just an origin story that's taken very seriously because it's a religion. But there's aspects of Jesus's upbringing that are very similar to aspects of Moses's upbringing, and again that are similar to these. Again, look, Jesus is someone who was raised by not exactly a foster family, because Mary, it's the virgin birth and everything. But I guess it kind of makes Joseph not his real father. You know what I mean? You can debate those points, I guess. But yeah, Superman certainly is similar to Jesus in certain ways, in a similar way that he's similar to Moses, in that he's this very selfless, altruistic person who's fighting for the good of the people and is incorruptible, and again, that's something that you find in almost every religion. They have a character like that who's supposed to be either a savior or a messiah or a role model or all three for people, the way that people should act. And so again, I think that Siegel and Schuster weren't trying to really make him Christ-like, just like they weren't trying to make him Moses. Like they were just sort of drawing from all these different stories from all these different religions and cultures, sort of like the way that George Lucas was drawing from all these different religions and mythologies and genres of old movies when he was creating the first Star Wars movie. You know, there's references to Westerns and dramas like Casablanca, and there's references to like Japanese samurai movies in that film in Star Wars. And so similarly, I think it's this big, one of the reasons Star Wars is successful is this big sort of cross-cultural stew of influences. And I think the same is true with Siegel and Schuster's original Superman as well. So, and yes, yes, Joe Shuster was Canadian. Yes, that is true. His family was from Toronto. I believe originally his family was from Ukraine, by the way, if I'm not mistaken. And so certainly very, very relevant to what's unfortunately happening right now. But yeah, his family is from, they did live in Canada before they lived in Cleveland. And yeah, I have a lot of Canadian friends that are very proud of that fact. So yes.
It's a good homage to the Canadians and Superman. One more question about Superman from an 11-year-old who's watching right now. They say that since Superman was a symbol of people who often feel overlooked, I would add marginalized, was it also popular with the Black community at the time?
I don't know. I do know that there is a character that was created about a year after Superman called Namor the Submariner, who's the idea is that Namor, his father is human and his mother is from Atlantis, and the Atlantean people mostly have blue skin, and Namor does not. He looks like a white person in his complexion, but his skin color. But what's different about it, and what's the reason I'm bringing it up, is because there's a couple different points where Carl Burgos, the creator, not Carl Burgos, is it Vince Vago? I think it's Vince Vago, the creator of the original Namor, where he mentions in that story that Namor is fighting against white people. He specifically says that. And so it's put through that it's definitely very strongly implied in that story that Namor feels that he is not of the human race, and that if he is, he's of another race. Do you know what I mean? That he's not, he doesn't see himself as having white privilege, and that being white and having the privileges that comes with. And I thought that's a very curious thing to put in a story in 1939, with this character who again looks white, but he also has pointy ears and he has little wings on his feet, and it's comics. Comics are ridiculous. It's comics. He has wings on his feet. Why? I don't know. It's comics. There's no good reason. If he's half Atlantean, they live under the sea. Why does he have wings on his feet exactly? I don't know. Well, it's interesting.
He comes out of the sea, right? He has to do something when he's out of the sea.
And I'm sure that's what the creators of Namor thought.
You got to be able to get from the sea to the action.
Yeah.
So flying was important. A number of people have raised the concept of the golem. And
yes.
I'm curious because for those of us, and I highly recommend The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which talks a lot about the golem. And I'm curious how that concept of creating a life out of clay, which is very much part of a Jewish folk tale, found its way into comics in the 30s and 40s, and perhaps forward from that.
Well, yeah, it's certainly a good question. There's even a chapter from Krakow to Krypton called Super Golem, where I talk about that whole issue, but I'll just summarize it right now very quickly, which is that, yeah, some people think that Superman is kind of a golem figure simply because he to do this, I think I need to just very quickly explain what the golem is. He's a figure in Jewish
Sure.
folklore dating back, I believe, at least to the 17th century and possibly before then.
I think even
And the
before.
idea is and the idea is that you create a figure out of clay and you write the word emet, which means truth, on its forehead, and that brings it to life. And to deactivate the golem, you just take off the aleph, and then you're left with the word met, which means dead. So he dies. And the idea is that the golem's sort of created in times of crisis, when he's the only thing necessary, the only thing that can help the Jews when they're being persecuted, when they're in the ghetto, when they're being sort of persecuted by the powers that be, the ruling class or whatever. And so Superman fulfills a similar function. I've always thought that it's a little bit of a stretch to say that Superman is a golem figure. I just think that he's so vaguely similar to the golem that I think it's a little bit of a stretch. I do think that there's other comic book superheroes that you can say are more of a golem type figure, whether it's intentional or not. And I certainly talked to Stan Lee about this when I interviewed him for the book From Krakow to Krypton. Like, for example, the Thing from the Fantastic Four, he seems more obviously like a golem figure because he's literally made out of a bunch of rocks. So it seems similar to a mud man like the golem. And also he feels like a freak and a monster. Also the Incredible Hulk, which was, I know for a fact that the Incredible Hulk was influenced by Frankenstein's monster, by the depiction of Frankenstein's monster in the 1930s movies starring Boris Karloff. And I know for a fact that Frankenstein's monster, the Mary Shelley novel, was at least partially influenced by the legend of the golem. So, so the Hulk is sort of like the golem, like twice removed or something like that. And yes, it's not as though I have all these props hidden around here just in case I can possibly use them. I said that would be crazy. Who would do such a thing? But so those are, I think, other characters that are more golem like. When I talked to Stan Lee about it, he said that he didn't mean for those characters to be golem like, but he can certainly see where there's potentially a similarity. And by the way, because people have been bringing up that the similarity between Superman and the golem, they've been bringing it up in pop culture historian circles and pop culture critic circles for decades. I wrote a story it's a little over a decade ago for one of the DC holiday specials where Superman fights a snow golem, or a snowlem, if you will. And he does have the word Emmet written on his forehead. And I did put that in the stage directions or art notes of the script so that the artist would put it in there. And it turns out that it's accidentally been sent to attack Superman by a little Jewish boy who's lonely on Hanukkah. And it's a fun, heartwarming story, and I'm very proud of it.
I have maybe two short, because we're really out of time, but there's one great question I think would be great to close on. But
please.
First, it says, where's Krakow? We haven't talked about Krakow, and it was in the title. Can you give us a Krakow reference before we close?
Yeah, sure. The reason I called it From Krakow to Krypton, aside from the fact that it's catchy because it's two K words, is that on a more serious note, that a lot of these Jewish creators were either from the golden age of comics, were either immigrants or children of immigrants whose families came from that general area. So you had people like Joe Kubert, who co-created Sergeant Rock and a lot of other DC characters from the 50s and 60s. His family came from Poland. I don't think they were from Krakow. My family did live in Krakow before the Holocaust. We lost a lot of family members because of the Holocaust. I'm a grandchild of survivors. So, I mean, it's certainly, to me as a comic book writer and comic book creator, that I guess that's where there's a Krakow connection there. There were other Poland is where a lot of Jewish cartoonists and illustrators from that generation came from, like Maurice Sundek, the children's book illustrator. And you can certainly argue that some of his books count as comics. Maybe you can say I'm splitting hairs because I don't know that he counted many of those as comics, but I know that he did draw some comics throughout his career, aside from his children's books. His family was from Poland. I'm trying to think if they were from Krakow or not. But a lot of Jews that ended up in the comics industry in the 30s and 40s, their families were either from Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Lithuania, Austria, Hungary, sort of that general area. And so that's because of the fact that I found a few comics creators whose families were from Poland. I thought it was certainly germane to the topic, and that it was a good idea to put Krakow in there. And also because of my own personal connection to Krakow. We were in Krakow from the 1700s until the 1930s. Because I went back years ago. I did a bunch of lectures at the Jewish Culture Festival in Krakow. And I was able to go on like a roots tour and see where my family used to live. And it's really bittersweet because you know that there's a very specific reason that they don't live there anymore. You know?
Yes.
So the building where they used to live until the Holocaust happened.
It is certainly bittersweet, but it's also a place where we can see that those almost 1,000 years of life that once existed there. So it's a very emotional and meaningful place to begin and end. And so thank you, Arie. I do want to ask everyone, please take a look next Wednesday, April 20th. The Workers' Circle is actually going virtually to Krakow and Warsaw. We're going to be holding a program going back and speaking to some of our modern day superheroes, people who we have worked with who are now on the front lines supporting and helping Ukrainian refugees. And all of you can learn more and sign up for this and other Workers' Circle programs at circle.org/events. But again, I want to thank Arie. I'm hoping we will be able to continue this conversation with Arie soon. We'll have more programs along these lines because let's face it, this world needs more superheroes and we need their inspiration. So thank you all for joining us. I hope to see you again, perhaps next Wednesday when we'll be live from Poland talking about the Ukraine crisis and how people we know are stepping up and helping refugees resettle. Thank you all for attending and look for an email from us sharing more information about this fascinating topic from Krakow to Krypton and our Jewish superheroes from yesterday, today, and hopefully tomorrow. Thank you and good night.